Savannah Monroe sat in front of her vanity mirror, staring at her reflection. The golden chandelier above cast a soft glow over her delicate features, making her look ethereal, almost unreal, like a doll, perfectly arranged and lifeless. Her wedding dress, custom-made from the finest Italian silk, clung to her body with precision. Tiny pearls and diamonds were stitched into the bodice, shimmering under the light. Her mother had insisted on the veil being hand-embroidered in Paris, and the weight of it rested heavy on her head. Tonight was her engagement party, an event that was supposed to celebrate the merging of two powerful families. The Monroe Empire, built on luxury real estate, and the Lockwood dynasty, one of the wealthiest investment firms in the country. This marriage had nothing to do with love. It was a transaction. An agreement. A prison sentence disguised as a fairy tale. Savannah clenched her hands in her lap, trying to suppress the rising panic in her chest. She had always known her life would be controlled by her father, Samuel Monroe. He was a man who built his fortune through ruthless deals, crushing competitors without remorse. His daughter was nothing more than another asset to him, a piece to be moved in the grand game of power. And tonight, that game reached its final stage, her engagement to Theo Lockwood. Theo. Just thinking of his name made her stomach turn. He was everything she despised in men, arrogant, entitled, and completely devoid of warmth. He had once whispered to her at a family gathering, "After we're married, I expect obedience, Savannah. I don't tolerate rebellion." His hand had lingered too long on her wrist, gripping it just enough to send a message. A chill ran down her spine as she recalled the encounter. There was no way she could go through with this. She would rather die than spend her life under his control. A knock on the door snapped her out of her thoughts. "Sweetheart, are you ready?" Her mother's voice was gentle, but there was something in her tone, something forced. Savannah inhaled sharply. "Yes, I'll be down in a minute." She heard her mother hesitate before walking away. She was giving her a moment of privacy, perhaps sensing her daughter's turmoil but too afraid to question it. Savannah looked at herself one last time. This was the moment. She had planned for this. There was no turning back now. She pushed herself up from the vanity chair and walked to the large window of her bedroom. The estate grounds stretched out below, lush gardens, marble fountains, and beyond them, a long driveway where the valets parked the luxury cars of the guests. The engagement party was in full swing, the sound of classical music floating in the air. She placed her hands on the windowsill, feeling the cool evening breeze against her skin. She had studied this escape for weeks. The second-floor window was high, but the garden below had a thick hedge that could break her fall. If she angled herself right, she wouldn't get hurt too badly. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Her father would never forgive her. Theo would hunt her down. But she didn't care. Freedom was worth the risk. Without giving herself time to hesitate, she kicked off her heels and climbed onto the windowsill. Her dress made it difficult, but she gathered the fabric and took a deep breath. The world seemed to slow as she let herself fall. Wind rushed past her face, and then, impact. A sharp jolt of pain shot through her ankle as she crashed into the hedge, branches scraping against her arms. She gasped, momentarily disoriented, but there was no time to assess the damage. She scrambled out of the bush, her pulse racing. And then she heard it. A low chuckle. She froze. Someone had seen her. Slowly, she turned her head, and locked eyes with a man standing just a few feet away. Tall. Dark-haired. Broad-shouldered. He was dressed in a sharp black suit, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His expression was unreadable, but there was amusement dancing in his piercing blue eyes. Savannah's stomach clenched. She had no idea who he was. But judging by the way he was watching her, he wasn't just some random guest. He had seen everything. And that meant trouble. Savannah's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the man in front of her. The weight of the situation crashed down on her. She had just thrown herself out of a second-story window in a desperate attempt to escape, and now, someone had witnessed the entire thing. Her bare feet sank into the cool grass, the silk of her gown torn at the hem where it had snagged on the bushes. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she took a slow step backward, her mind racing through possible explanations, excuses, anything to salvage this moment before it spiraled further out of her control. The man, still holding his glass of whiskey, watched her with unsettling calmness. The faint smirk on his lips suggested amusement rather than concern, which only made her more nervous. His dark suit was tailored to perfection, emphasizing his powerful frame. His sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes gave him an air of someone who was used to being in control, someone who didn't react with shock or panic, someone who observed and calculated. "Well," he finally said, his voice deep and smooth. "That's certainly not something you see every day." Savannah clenched her fists. She had expected a lot of things to go wrong tonight, her father catching her before she could escape, Theo locking her in a room until the wedding, even the risk of breaking an ankle from the jump. But this? This was an entirely different problem. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice sharp. The man tilted his head slightly, as if he found her question amusing. "I should be the one asking that, considering you just fell from the sky like a runaway bride in a poorly executed escape plan." Savannah's cheeks burned with frustration. She didn't have time for games. Every second she stood here, she risked being found. "Listen," she said, taking another step back, "I don't know who you are, but I need to leave." "You didn't see anything. Understand?" The man took a slow sip of his whiskey, his gaze never leaving hers. He looked completely unbothered, as if they were discussing the weather rather than a dramatic escape. "You expect me to ignore the fact that Samuel Monroe's daughter just flung herself out of a window at her own engagement party?" His smirk widened, and Savannah felt her stomach tighten. He knew who she was. That was bad. Very bad. She swallowed hard, her thoughts racing. If he knew her father, there was a high chance he was connected to him in some way. A business associate, perhaps. Another powerful investor. That meant there was a strong chance he would turn her in, either out of loyalty or for some kind of leverage. And yet, he hadn't called for security. He hadn't alerted anyone. Why? She straightened her posture, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I don't know what you want, but if you think I'm going to let you drag me back inside, you're wrong." His expression didn't change. He seemed more entertained by her than anything else. "And what exactly is your plan, princess?" Her stomach twisted at the nickname. "Run," she answered simply. His brows lifted, as if she had just told him the most ridiculous thing he'd ever heard. "Run." Savannah's jaw tightened. "Yes. And you're going to let me?" He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Oh, sweetheart, I don't think you fully understand the situation you're in. Running is the easy part. Staying hidden. That's where it gets tricky." Her heartbeat quickened. She didn't like the way he was looking at her. Not with lust, nor cruelty, but something else, something that made her feel like she was standing on the edge of a very dangerous decision. She took another step back. "I'll take my chances." He sighed, as if disappointed in her answer. "Your father will find you before sunrise. You know that, don't you?" She hated how much truth there was in his words. Samuel Monroe was not the kind of man who tolerated defiance. He would turn the entire city upside down to drag her back, and she wouldn't be able to stop him. Theo, with his sickening possessiveness, would make sure she never got another chance to escape. She could already picture it, being locked away in some lavish hotel suite with guards outside her door, forced to marry a man she despised. No. She refused. Savannah took a deep breath. "I don't care. I'd rather run and fail than stay and suffer." For the first time, something shifted in the man's expression. It wasn't amusement anymore, it was interest. "You're serious," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Savannah didn't move. "I don't have a choice." He watched her for a long moment, then finally exhaled and set his drink down on a nearby stone ledge. "All right," he said casually. "I'll help you." Savannah blinked. She must have misheard him. "You'll what?" He shrugged. "Help you. Get out of here. Stay hidden. Whatever you need." She took a cautious step forward, her mind scrambling to understand. "Why would you do that?" A slow smirk tugged at his lips. "Because I like interesting people." "And you? You just made my night a lot more interesting." That wasn't an answer. "Not really." She narrowed her eyes. "Who are you?" He extended a hand. "Ryden Holloway." Savannah's breath caught. She knew that name. Ryden Holloway wasn't just some guest. He was one of the most powerful CEOs in the country, head of Holloway Industries, a multi-billion-dollar empire that her father had tried, and failed, to do business with multiple times. He was notorious for being ruthless in negotiations, for never bending to anyone's rules. And now he was offering to help her. Savannah stared at his outstretched hand, then at his face. She had a choice to make. Trust a man she had just met. Or try to run alone and almost certainly get caught. Her fingers hesitated before finally, she slipped her hand into his. "Let's get out of here," Ryden said, his grip firm and steady. And just like that, everything changed. Savannah sat stiffly in the passenger seat of the sleek black car as it sped down the empty highway. The city lights blurred outside the tinted windows, their glow casting fleeting shadows across Ryden Holloway's sharp, unreadable features. The leather interior smelled of expensive cologne and polished wood, and the dashboard was illuminated with soft blue light from the digital display. The entire setting felt surreal, as if she had stepped into a different world, a world where she was no longer the daughter of Samuel Monroe, a pawn in her father's game, but something else entirely. She stole a glance at the man driving beside her. Ryden's grip on the steering wheel was relaxed, his expression neutral, but there was an undeniable intensity in his posture, a quiet confidence that told her he was always in control. He didn't drive like someone who was rushing or panicking, he drove with purpose. As if he had already planned every move ahead of time. Savannah, on the other hand, felt like she was unraveling by the second. Her entire body was still trembling with adrenaline from the jump, from the fear of being caught, from the sheer insanity of what she had just done. She had escaped. But now what? She had no money. No plan. No idea where to go. And the only person she could rely on was a stranger she had met less than an hour ago. "You're quiet," Ryden remarked, his voice smooth but edged with something she couldn't quite place. Savannah snapped out of her thoughts. "I just threw myself out of a window to escape my own engagement party. Forgive me if I'm still processing." Ryden let out a low chuckle, not taking his eyes off the road. "Fair point." Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions. Finally, Savannah turned to face him fully. "Why are you helping me?" Ryden exhaled slowly, as if debating how much he wanted to tell her. Then, with a slight smirk, he said, "Because I hate parties." Savannah scowled. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I feel like giving right now." She crossed her arms, unimpressed. "That's convenient." He glanced at her briefly, his blue eyes gleaming under the dim glow of the dashboard lights. "So is meeting a billionaire on the same night you decide to flee your entire life?" She hated how he had a point. Savannah leaned her head back against the seat, exhaling sharply. "Where are we going?" "For now. Somewhere safe." His vague answer only frustrated her more. "Look, I appreciate the getaway car and all, but if you think I'm just going to blindly follow you without knowing what's next, you're mistaken," she said, her voice firm. Raiden finally pulled the car onto a quieter road, away from the city center, and slowed to a stop outside a high-rise building with a minimalist design and an entrance guarded by security. He shifted in his seat and turned to her fully, his gaze locking onto hers. "You have two options, Savannah," he said, his tone calm but unyielding. "Option 1, you get out here, figure things out on your own, and try to outrun your father and Theo with no money, no resources, and nowhere to go. Considering who they are, I'd give you, maybe 12 hours before they find you." Savannah swallowed, her stomach twisting. She knew he wasn't exaggerating. Her father had the influence to track her down before sunrise. "Option 2, she asked, her voice quieter now. "Option 2, you come inside, we talk, and I help you disappear properly." Savannah narrowed her eyes. "In exchange for what?" A slow smirk tugged at his lips. "You're learning quickly." She didn't return the smile. Raiden exhaled, leaning back against his seat. "I don't do charity, Savannah. But I do like people who know how to handle business. You're the daughter of Samuel Monroe. That means you weren't just raised to wear designer dresses and look pretty, you were raised to understand power." She stared at him, her pulse quickening. He was right. Her father had never let her be truly involved in his business, but she had spent her entire life watching, listening, studying. She knew how deals worked, how empires were built and destroyed. "And," she prompted, feeling the weight of what he was about to say. "And," Raiden continued, "I have my own reasons for wanting to keep you out of their hands. But if I'm going to help you, I expect something in return." Savannah's mind spun. "What do you want from me?" He tilted his head slightly. "Your skills. Your knowledge. Your name, when necessary. You've spent your life surrounded by men like your father, men like Theo. I want to know what you know. I want to use it." Savannah's heart pounded. This wasn't just a rescue, this was a business proposal. Raiden wasn't just offering her safety. He was offering her a seat at his table. She hesitated. Trusting him was dangerous. But going out there alone? That was suicide. Savannah took a deep breath, gripping the edge of her dress as if to ground herself. "All right," she said finally. "Let's talk." Raiden's smirk widened just slightly, as if he had known she would say yes all along. "Good choice." He opened his door and stepped out, walking around to her side of the car. Savannah took one last deep breath before following him into the unknown. Savannah followed Raiden into the high-rise building, her bare feet making almost no sound against the cool marble floor of the entrance lobby. The space was minimalistic yet exuded understated luxury, glass, steel, and dark wood blending seamlessly. Soft lighting created a warm atmosphere, but there was something clinical about it. The security guards at the front desk barely acknowledged them as Raiden led her toward a private elevator. He didn't say a word as he pressed a keycard against the panel, and the doors slid open silently. She hesitated for half a second before stepping inside. The moment the doors closed, trapping them in the confined space, Savannah could feel the tension between them shift. She was alone with a man she barely knew, relying on him to keep her safe. It was an unsettling realization. Raiden leaned against the side of the elevator, one hand casually resting in the pocket of his tailored slacks, the other tapping a slow rhythm against the polished steel wall. He didn't seem uncomfortable. If anything, he looked entirely in control, as if he owned not only the building but the entire damn city. She studied his reflection in the elevator doors. Everything about him screamed power, his crisp black suit, the effortless confidence, the way he held himself. But there was something else beneath the surface, something she couldn't quite place yet. "You're overthinking," he remarked without looking at her. Savannah blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" He finally turned his gaze toward her, his blue eyes sharp and assessing. "You keep looking at me like you're trying to figure out what my real motive is." She lifted her chin slightly. Maybe because I am. The corner of his mouth lifted in amusement. Good. I'd be disappointed if you weren't. The elevator chimed, and the doors opened into a penthouse that was just as sleek and modern as the rest of the building. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a breathtaking view of the city skyline, the lights shimmering in the distance. Savannah stepped out hesitantly, her eyes scanning the space. Dark hardwood floors, a sunken living room with a massive sectional couch, an open kitchen with black marble countertops. It was a stark contrast to the old-money opulence she had grown up in. Ryden walked past her, loosening the buttons of his suit jacket as he made his way to the bar. He poured himself another glass of whiskey before glancing over his shoulder at her. Drink? Savannah shook her head, still standing near the elevator, unsure of what to do next. I think I need answers more than I need alcohol right now. Ryden smirked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass before taking a sip. Fair enough. Sit. She hesitated, then finally moved toward the couch, sinking into the plush cushions. The exhaustion of the night was starting to catch up to her, but she forced herself to stay alert. Ryden sat across from her in a sleek armchair, resting his glass on the side table. So, he said, his voice casual but laced with something heavier. Tell me. How long have you been planning to run? Savannah exhaled slowly. Weeks. His brow lifted slightly. And your plan was, what? Jumping out of a window and hoping for the best. She glared at him. It was a last resort. He chuckled, shaking his head. Not much of a plan. Do you think I had options? She snapped. Do you have any idea what my father is like? What Theo is like? Ryden leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. I know exactly what men like them are like. Savannah frowned, suddenly curious. Do you? Something flickered in his eyes, but it was gone just as quickly. Tell me why you ran, he said instead, ignoring her question. She hesitated, gripping the fabric of her torn dress in her lap. It wasn't that she didn't want to answer, it was that saying it out loud made it more real. My father arranged my engagement to Theo without asking me, she said quietly. He told me it was my duty to the family. That love wasn't important, only loyalty and power. Ryden didn't react, but she could tell he wasn't surprised. Theo, he's not just controlling, she continued, her voice tightening. He's dangerous. He made it very clear that once I married him, I wouldn't have a say in anything. I'd be his. Completely. Her stomach twisted at the memory of Theo's hand gripping her wrist, his voice a low whisper in her ear. You belong to me, Savannah. You'll learn. She forced the thought away. I knew if I didn't leave now, I never would. She lifted her gaze to meet Ryden's. I don't expect you to understand. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, to her surprise, he let out a slow breath and nodded. Oh, I understand. Savannah narrowed her eyes. There was something in his tone, something that suggested he wasn't just saying it to placate her. You know, he continued, leaning forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees, most people in your position wouldn't have jumped. They would have stayed, convinced themselves that things wouldn't be that bad. That they could endure it. Savannah held his gaze. I'm not most people. A slow smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. No, you're not. A heavy silence stretched between them. Savannah exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face. So what now? Ryden sat back again, studying her. That depends. On what? On how much you're willing to trust me. Savannah tensed. Trust? That was a luxury she couldn't afford. I don't trust easily, she admitted. His lips twitched as if he expected that answer. Good. That means you're not naive. She frowned. Then why ask me that? Ryden set his drink down and leaned forward again, his voice lower now. Because if I'm going to help you, Savannah, I need to know that you're all in. No second guessing. No hesitations. If you want to disappear, you have to let me handle things my way. Her pulse quickened. There was something about the way he said it, calm, confident, but with an underlying edge, that sent a shiver down her spine. He wasn't just offering her a hiding place. He was offering her something bigger. A way out. A way to fight back. A way to become something more than just a runaway bride. And the scariest part? She was considering it. Savannah took a slow breath. What exactly do you have in mind? Ryden's smirk deepened. Let's start with a new identity. Savannah sat motionless, her mind struggling to process Ryden's words. A new identity. The weight of what he was suggesting settled deep in her chest, pressing against her ribs like a tightening vice. Was she really ready for this? She had run away with nothing but the clothes on her back, no real plan, no resources. But abandoning her identity entirely? That was something else entirely. She exhaled slowly, lifting her gaze to meet Ryden's. You're serious. Ryden leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. I don't say things I don't mean. Savannah studied him. The way he spoke, the way he moved, it was clear he was a man used to being in control, to making decisions with absolute certainty. There was no hesitation in his voice, no doubt in his eyes. Still, she couldn't ignore the unease curling in her stomach. And what exactly does that mean? A new identity? You want me to fake my death or something? Ryden smirked, but there was something dark behind it. That would be dramatic, even for you. Savannah crossed her arms. Then tell me what you mean. He exhaled, tapping his fingers against the armrest of his chair. Disappearing isn't just about running. Your father has connections everywhere, police, private investigators, politicians. If you try to hide as you, he'll find you. But if Savannah Monroe ceases to exist, he has nothing to chase. The logical part of her knew he was right. Her father's influence ran deeper than most people realized. He wasn't just a real estate mogul, he had government officials in his pocket, law enforcement on his payroll. Running wouldn't be enough. She needed to erase herself. Savannah swallowed hard. So what, I just become a completely different person. Change my name, my history, my entire life. Ryden met her gaze, his blue eyes sharp and assessing. Yes. And if you do this, there's no going back. Her breath hitched. No going back. She clenched her fists in her lap. Could she really do this? Leave behind everything she had ever known, her home, her identity, her past. A part of her rebelled at the idea. But then she thought of her father. She thought of Theo. And she knew, there was no future for her in that world. Savannah inhaled deeply. How? Ryden's lips quirked slightly, as if he had expected that answer. He stood, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out his phone. With a few taps, he sent a message before slipping the device back into his pocket. I have someone who specializes in these things. New identities, clean records, full digital erasure. But it won't be instant. It'll take time. Savannah frowned. And until then? Ryden walked over to the bar, pouring himself another drink. Until then, you stay here. Lay low. We do this properly. Something about the way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. And what happens if my father finds me before this new identity is ready? Ryden took a slow sip of his whiskey, then set the glass down with a soft clink. Then we make sure he doesn't. The certainty in his voice unsettled her. It wasn't arrogance, it was something colder, something far more dangerous. Savannah shifted on the couch. You keep saying we. Why do you care so much about this? About me? Ryden studied her for a long moment. The silence between them stretched, heavy with something unspoken. Then, finally, he spoke. Because men like your father think they own the world, he said quietly. They take what they want. They destroy anyone who stands in their way. And I enjoy reminding them that they're not as untouchable as they think. Savannah swallowed. There was something personal in his voice, something that hinted at a history she didn't know. Did my father try to destroy you? She asked. Ryden smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. Oh, he tried. She leaned forward slightly. And? His gaze darkened. He failed. Savannah exhaled, her mind spinning. She had spent her life surrounded by powerful men, but Ryden was different. He didn't just wield power, he understood it. And for some reason, he had decided to use it to help her. Or maybe, she thought warily, to use her for something bigger. She needed to be careful. But for now, she had no choice but to trust him. She sat back against the couch, running a hand through her tangled hair. All right, she said finally. What's step one? Ryden's smirk returned, but this time, it carried a glint of something dangerous. Step one, he said, is making sure the world thinks you've disappeared. Savannah's stomach twisted. She had a feeling she wasn't going to like what that involved. Savannah hadn't been able to sleep. The events of the night replayed in her mind like a film stuck on a loop, her father's cold voice, Theo's possessive grip on her wrist, the moment she had stood on that window ledge, breathless, before taking the leap. And now, here she was, in the penthouse of a man she barely knew, discussing how to erase her existence. Her body still hummed with adrenaline, her nerves frayed from the weight of what she had agreed to. She stared up at the ceiling, wrapped in a blanket on the oversized couch in Ryden's living room. He had offered her the guest bedroom, but she hadn't wanted to be closed in. A locked door felt too much like a prison. The city skyline stretched endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the lights glittering like stars against the dark. Somewhere out there, her father was already hunting for her. She turned onto her side, clutching the blanket tighter around herself. She had never been truly alone before. Even when she was miserable, even when she had felt suffocated in her father's world, she had still been surrounded, by staff, by security, by expectations. But this? This was something else entirely. A part of her felt weightless, free in a way she had never been before. But another part of her was terrified. What if she was making a mistake? What if trusting Ryden would only lead to something worse? She exhaled sharply, pushing the thought away. She didn't have the luxury of second-guessing herself. She had already jumped. There was no going back now. A soft noise broke the silence. She tensed, her pulse quickening. Footsteps. She sat up abruptly, her heart pounding as Ryden stepped into the living room. He was dressed in black sweatpants and a fitted t-shirt, the sharp, corporate image from earlier stripped away. But he still carried himself with that same effortless control, his presence filling the room as if he owned not just the penthouse, but the very air around him. "You're awake," he observed, his voice low and smooth. Savannah swallowed. "So are you." Ryden smirked slightly, then gestured to the glass of whiskey in his hand. "I don't sleep much." She studied him, noting the faint shadows under his eyes, the tension in his jaw. "Because of work?" she asked. "Because of habit." Savannah pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "Do you ever stop?" Ryden took a slow sip of his drink before setting the glass down on the table. No. A part of her believed him. She exhaled, resting her forehead against her knees. "I feel like I should be more scared." Ryden tilted his head. "Are you?" She looked up at him. "No. And that's what scares me." He studied her for a long moment. "Because you don't know if you should trust me?" She shook her head. Because I don't know if I care anymore. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Ryden didn't react the way she expected. He didn't tell her she was being dramatic or roll his eyes at her confession. He just nodded, as if he understood something she didn't. You care, he said simply. Otherwise, you wouldn't have run. Savannah swallowed. I don't know what comes next. Ryden leaned against the arm of the couch, his voice softer than before. You don't have to. She frowned. That's not an answer. He smirked. No, but it's the truth. Savannah exhaled, leaning back against the cushions. She hated how much sense he made. She glanced at the whiskey glass. Do you ever stop thinking? Ryden chuckled. No. Her lips twitched slightly. Figures. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that settled, that allowed her to breathe. For the first time in hours, Savannah felt something close to calm. Ryden reached for his drink again, taking another slow sip. Tomorrow, he said, we start making you disappear. Savannah nodded, but she knew the truth. She had already disappeared. Now, she just had to figure out who she was going to become. The morning light streamed through the penthouse windows, casting a golden glow over the polished marble floors. Savannah blinked against the brightness, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The weight of the last 24 hours pressed down on her chest as reality set in. She had run from everything she had ever known, and there was no turning back. The smell of coffee lingered in the air, pulling her attention toward the kitchen. Ryden stood at the counter, dressed in dark slacks and a crisp, untucked dress shirt. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing strong forearms, and his fingers wrapped around a steaming black mug. He looked completely at ease, as if he hadn't just helped her throw away her entire life. Savannah pushed the blanket off her lap and stretched, her muscles aching from sleeping on the couch. You made coffee? She asked, her voice rough from exhaustion. Ryden glanced at her, a smirk tugging at his lips. I don't function without it. Savannah walked over, rubbing her arms against the slight morning chill. She hesitated before reaching for a second cup. Thanks. Ryden handed her the mug without a word, watching as she took a slow sip. The heat spread through her, momentarily grounding her. It was strange, standing here like this, sharing a quiet morning with a man she barely knew. She had spent her whole life being told what to do, what to wear, how to behave. Now, there were no expectations. No rules. Just an uncertain future and the man in front of her. Savannah set the cup down, exhaling. So. How exactly do you plan to erase me? Ryden's expression remained unreadable. It's not just about erasing you. It's about replacing you. She frowned. Meaning? You need a new name, a new past. New financial records, a history that won't raise questions. He leaned against the counter, his gaze sharp. You can't just disappear, Savannah. That's how people get caught. You have to become someone else. Her stomach tightened. A new name. A new past. It wasn't just running away, it was rewriting herself completely. She swallowed hard. Do you really know someone who can do all that? Ryden smirked. I know the best. His confidence unsettled her. She ran a hand through her tangled hair. And what happens to the old me? Ryden sipped his coffee. That depends on how much noise you want to make. Savannah's fingers curled around the edge of the counter. You mean how much I want to hurt my father? Ryden tilted his head slightly. Wouldn't be the worst idea. She let out a bitter laugh. You don't know him. He'll never stop looking. Ryden's expression darkened, his voice quieter now. Then we make sure he never finds you. Savannah felt something cold settle in her chest. She had grown up knowing her father was ruthless. That he would do anything for power. But until now, she had never considered what it might take to truly escape him. Ryden set his cup down and straightened. Get dressed. We're leaving in an hour. Savannah blinked. Where are we going? To get you a new life. An hour later, she sat in the passenger seat of Ryden's car as they drove through the city. Unlike the night before, this time, the streets were alive, businessmen rushing to offices, tourists exploring the sidewalks, taxis honking impatiently at intersections. For the first time in years, Savannah wasn't being watched. No bodyguards trailing her every move. No expectations dictating where she could go or what she could do. It was both freeing and terrifying. She glanced at Ryden. He drove with the same quiet confidence as before, his fingers tapping idly against the steering wheel. So, who exactly is this person you're taking me to? She asked. Ryden didn't look away from the road. An old friend. Savannah arched an eyebrow. That's vague. Ryden smirked. It's intentional. She sighed, but before she could press further, he pulled into an underground parking garage. The space was nearly empty, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows along the concrete walls. Ryden parked near a steel door and killed the engine. Stay close, he said as he stepped out of the car. Savannah followed, her pulse quickening as he led her toward the entrance. He knocked twice, then once more in a different rhythm. The door creaked open. A tall, wiry man stood on the other side. He had sharp features, glasses perched on the bridge of his nose, and a look of mild disinterest. Ryden, he greeted, stepping aside to let them in. Ryden nodded. Jude. Savannah hesitated before stepping inside. The space looked like a cross between a hacker's den and a high-tech lab. Multiple computer screens lined the walls, displaying streams of code, security footage, and government databases. Jude studied her with calculating eyes. So this is the girl? Savannah bristled. I have a name. Jude smirked. Not for long. Her stomach twisted. Ryden placed a hand on her back, guiding her toward the center of the room. She needs a full reset. ID, bank accounts, social security records, the works. Jude let out a low whistle. That's not a small ask. Ryden pulled out his phone and typed something before turning the screen toward Jude. Jude's smirk disappeared. He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. You really don't do anything halfway, do you? Ryden's expression remained unreadable. Can you do it or not? Jude rolled his eyes. Of course I can do it. It's just going to cost you. Ryden slipped a black card from his wallet and set it on the table. Jude's eyes gleamed. Well, in that case, he cracked his knuckles and sat down at one of the computers. Let's get started. Savannah shifted uncomfortably. This is really happening. Ryden glanced at her. You still have time to change your mind. She inhaled sharply, looking at the screens filled with government records, names, histories. Her old life was slipping away, piece by piece. But then she thought of Theo's grip on her wrist. The way her father spoke about her like she was nothing but a pawn. She straightened her spine. No, she said. I don't. Ryden's lips quirked in something close to approval. Jude typed something into the computer, and Savannah watched as her name, her real name, was pulled up on the screen. Say goodbye to Savannah Monroe, Jude muttered. Because by the end of today, she won't exist. And just like that, the past started to fade. Savannah sat in the dimly lit room, staring at the screen in front of her as Jude's fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard. Lines of code, digital records, and government files flashed across the monitors, and with each tap of the keys, another piece of her old life disappeared. Her name. Her birth certificate. Her social security number. Everything that had ever legally tied her to the Monroe family was being rewritten, erased, buried beneath layers of false identities and fabricated histories. She watched in silence, gripping the edge of the chair with white-knuckled fingers. It was happening. It was really happening. The girl she had been, Savannah Monroe, daughter of Samuel Monroe, future wife of Theo Lockwood, was vanishing before her eyes. She should have felt relief. But all she felt was the crushing weight of uncertainty. Jude leaned back in his chair, cracking his knuckles. "All right, sweetheart. Let's talk about your new life." Savannah blinked, snapping out of her thoughts. "Right. What's the plan?" Jude smirked, his sharp eyes gleaming behind his glasses. "Well, first things first, you need a new name." Savannah hesitated. A name was more than just a word, it was an identity, a label, a foundation. Choosing a new one felt like trying to define a person she hadn't even become yet. Ryden, who had been leaning against the wall, arms crossed, spoke for the first time in a while. "Pick something strong." Savannah glanced at him, narrowing her eyes. "You think Savannah isn't strong?" Ryden's lips quirked slightly. "I think Savannah Monroe has too many enemies." She exhaled, rubbing her temples. "Fine. How do people usually do this?" Jude shrugged. "Some people keep their initials. Some pick a name that means something to them. Others throw a dart at a list of names and hope for the best." Savannah frowned. None of those options felt right. She didn't want to keep her initials, SM felt too tied to her past. But she also didn't want to pick something at random. She needed something that felt like hers. Something real. Her mind drifted to childhood memories. The only times she had ever felt free were the rare summers when she had convinced her mother to let her visit the countryside estate. There had been a sprawling lavender field behind the house, and she had spent hours lying in it, staring up at the sky, breathing in the scent of wildflowers. She hadn't felt trapped there. She had felt weightless. Savannah lifted her chin. "Lena." Jude raised an eyebrow. "Lena?" She nodded. "Lena Gray." It sounded right. Simple. Not tied to her father's legacy, not connected to her past. Just hers. Jude smirked, typing something into the system. "Lena Gray it is." Ryden studied her for a moment but said nothing. Jude continued working, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "All right, Lena Gray. You were born in California, raised in Chicago. Your parents were ordinary, middle class. No trust funds, no family empires. Just a girl who lived a quiet, unremarkable life." Savannah, Lena, listened as Jude built a story for her, each detail another thread in the web of her new identity. A new social security number. A new passport. A new bank account. By the time he was done, Savannah Monroe was nothing more than a ghost. Jude leaned back, satisfied. "And just like that, you're officially off the grid." Savannah exhaled slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. This was freedom. But before she could fully process it, Ryden pushed off the wall and straightened. His expression had lost its amusement, replaced by something sharper. "This isn't over yet," he said. Savannah frowned. "What do you mean?" Ryden pulled his phone from his pocket, tapped the screen, then turned it toward her. The blood drained from her face. On the screen was a news article. "Monroe heiress missing, family offers reward for information." Beneath the headline was a picture of her, one from a charity gala last year, her smile polished but empty. And below that, words that sent a chill down her spine. "Savannah Monroe, daughter of billionaire Samuel Monroe, has gone missing following what sources claim was a planned engagement party to Theo Lockwood. While the family has remained tight-lipped, private investigators have been hired to track her down." Monroe himself has issued a statement offering a substantial reward for any credible information leading to her safe return. Savannah clenched her fists. Of course. She had known her father would come after her, but seeing it spelled out like this made her stomach twist. Ryden's voice was calm, but there was a dangerous edge beneath it. This means two things. 1, he's desperate. 2, he's going to start tearing the city apart to find you. Jude let out a low whistle. That's a lot of money. Even the wrong people are gonna start looking for you now. Savannah swallowed hard. She had expected to be hunted. But she hadn't expected it to happen this fast. Ryden pocketed his phone. We need to move. Savannah straightened. Move where? Ryden didn't hesitate. Out of the city. Tonight. Her pulse spiked. Wait. I thought the plan was to stay under the radar until my new identity was settled. Ryden's jaw tightened. That was before your father turned this into a goddamn manhunt. If we stay, someone's going to recognize you, and once that happens, we lose our advantage. Savannah felt panic creeping up her spine. But where do we even go? Ryden met her gaze, his expression unreadable. I have a place. Jude snorted. You always have a place. Ryden ignored him. Savannah inhaled sharply. And then what? Ryden's eyes darkened. Then we make sure your father understands that you're never coming back. A shiver ran down her spine. He didn't just mean disappearing. He meant making a statement. Savannah's heart pounded. She had run to escape her father's control. But now, she had the chance to do more than that. She had the chance to take control herself. She met Ryden's gaze and, for the first time, didn't hesitate. Let's go. Ryden smirked, as if he had been waiting for her to say that all along. Jude sighed, rubbing his temples. I swear, you two are going to get me killed. Savannah ignored him. She was done running. Now, she was ready to fight.